Yeah, we're going to start off with Terry Sejnowski, who is a professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, where he directs the Computational Neurobiology Lab and also the Center for Theoretical, and is also director for the Center of Theoretical and Computational Biology. So he uses computer modeling techniques to understand the functions of the brain and also how we process information. He also looks at diseases such as schizophrenia or Parkinson, and see how these affect the brain, how the brain works. So I'm excited to hear more about what he has to say. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm very sorry I can't be joining you. I have other, unfortunately, conflicts here in San Diego, and it's very late. So I hope that I will be able to make it all the way through for the questions. So I know that the theme of this series of lectures has been the illusion of control. And I'm sorry that I haven't had the opportunity to discuss this issue of control. I know that it means many different things to many different people. I'm going to be focusing here on the issue of what do we know about the intelligence of ChatGPT. ChatGPT, I think everybody probably has either used it or knows about it, and it gives the illusion of intelligence. And so I'm going to be exploring here what we know about that, and a lot of interesting issues have come up as a consequence of this new AI program that is now only been out for a few months, but literally within 2 months, it had reached 100 million users, and by now it's probably double that. So in 2018, I wrote a book on the deep learning revolution, and GPT is basically a deep learning program. But it's an interesting one, very interesting. Many applications, deep learning, and this one probably is the one that has had the most impact on the public. Deep refers to the fact that these network models have many layers, as you can see here on the right. The input comes in and it goes through a sequence of layers consisting of units and the connections between the layers. And then ultimately there's an output, and the task that the network has depends on the training, and the training depends on the data it's been trained on. So, for example, a vision network will be given lots of images. It has to categorize speech recognition, a lot of inputs from audio that have to be translated into words. And now we have this GPT. It's a generative pre-trained transformer. And I'm going to unpack those three words. Generative means that you don't have to give it much of an input. It will produce an output sequentially. That is to say, it will continue to generate word after word after word. You don't have to give it an input for every output. It can generate sentences, paragraphs, and whole stories. Now, the origin, the book tells the origin story. Where does this come from? Well, it was all based on our understanding of the brain back in the 20th century, consisting of many neurons, large numbers of neurons, 100 billion in your brain, very highly connected. And the architecture, it all runs in parallel. And the key to being able to solve a problem rests on learning, and the learning depends on data. This is a very different paradigm from the one that was popular back in the 20th century, which was based on logic, symbols, and rules. And language was meant to be an example of that. What could be more symbolic than words in the sentence, and what could be more logical than being able to use the syntax in the sentence to come up with a meaning. But unfortunately, I think that that ran out of steam in the sense that it wasn't very practical. You couldn't actually create a program that could talk, but we have one now, which is based on this new paradigm. So that's the background. Now, okay, some of you may recognize this is the Captain Kirk, and behind him Spock from the Starship Enterprise, and they're holding. Kirk is holding in his hand a universal translator. Now, this is Star Trek. This is a science fiction movie, and this universal language translator was science fiction. In your pocket, you have a smartphone that can do language translation. For all practical purposes, we now have a universal language translator. And by the way, if you've ever used language translation with the most recent GPT version 4, GPT-4, the language translation is spectacularly better than it was even just a year ago. Okay, well, it's science fiction. Science fiction is here today. Even more of a shock was in 2017 when the world Go champion, Crick, was beaten by AlphaGo, a program by DeepMind. And Go is by far the most complex game that humans play. It's a 19 by 19 board, and there are more different positions on the board than there are atoms in the universe, right? This is a very complex game. And at the beginning, going into it, it was said that, there's no way that this machine can actually beat me. And afterwards, he said, after humanity spent thousands of years improving our tactics, computers tell us that humans are completely wrong. This had a much bigger impact in Asia than it had here, because very, very few people play Go here. But in Asia, it's a very important game. In fact, it's an art form. And he lost face. And it wasn't just him. It was, his culture lost face. And the Chinese, as a consequence, started a $5 billion AI program that is ongoing right now. So it was a Sputnik moment for them. If, back in the 1950s, when the Russians put a satellite around going over the United States, this was a wake-up call, and for science and for engineering in the U.S. and this is now happening in China for AI. Okay, ChatGPT. I think how do we even think of how should we approach it? I think we should approach it as if an extraterrestrial alien suddenly landed and started talking to us in English. I think that's the right analogy. The problem is that the only thing we know for sure about ChatGPT is that it's not human, but it sure sounds like one. So this is a mystery, and this is really what the focus of this lecture is going to be about. It gives us the illusion of intelligence, but is it intelligent? And what do we mean by intelligent? So I'm going to try to frame this lecture with a story about a talking dog. So the story starts with a driver driving along back roads in rural America and comes across a sign, "Talking dog for sale." And he's really curious, so he goes to the farmhouse, and the farmer takes him to the backyard, and there's a border collie who is there in the background, and the border collie says, "Woof woof, my name is Carl. Pleased to meet you." And the driver was flabbergasted and said, "How did you learn how to talk?" And Carl says, "I went to a top secret language school for the CIA, and they taught me 3 languages: English, Russian, and Chinese." And now the poor guy is really confused and says, you went to a CIA language school, and what did you do for the CIA? And Carl says, well, they flew me all over the world, and I would sit in a corner when there was negotiations with foreign agents and diplomats, and I would listen in on what they were saying because they didn't know I could understand them. And then I would later tell the handlers what I had heard. And now the driver is absolutely stunned. He says, "You were a spy for the CIA?" And Carl says, "Yes. And when I retired, they gave me the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, the highest honor of the CIA. And they made me an honorary citizen of the United States." Well, the driver went back to the farmer and said, "How much do you want for the dog?" And the farmer says, I'll give you the dog for $10. And the driver says, "You're going to sell this amazing dog for $10? The farmer laughs and says, "You didn't believe all that bullshit about the CIA, did you?" Okay. So here we have GPT is the equivalent of a talking dog, and we may not be we can use English to talk, but not everything that the dog says might be truthful. And the question is, how did it learn how to talk? Okay, so this, the language, the first language, the big major language network back, this for the time, it was a large language model, but actually it was tiny by today's standards, was called NetTalk, and something I worked on in the 80s. And the task here is to convert letters to sounds. So here we have a window of letters, and the train is trained to pronounce the phoneme for the middle letter. So the C, as you can see here, should be give you an output that is the hard C, the K in cat. Now, it had about 20,000 connection strengths that had to be trained, and it had about 200 units. And by today's standards, it's tiny because the latest network, GPT-4, has 1 trillion weights, right? So this is like, it has been scaled up by 12 orders of magnitude. Now, what is really interesting, though, about the training is that when you start, you put a corpus through a bunch of your text that you're translating, you want to pronounce, and the teacher gives the correct pronunciation, and that compares to the one that the network produces, and on the basis of the difference, you back propagate the error and you tweak all the weights in order to improve the performance. And it goes through a series of phases. I'm going to play you the very beginning, when it was just getting off, literally just de novo learning. Well, what you hear is a series of vowels and consonants that obviously not correctly translated, but it perseverates. It will say ba 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 ga ga da, in the sense that it's looking for the major regularities, and the major regularity is vowel and consonant. It gets that right. That's the first thing it gets right, and then it refines things. It goes through a stage where it gets small words right, and then finally, at the end of training, and at this point, it was running overnight on a training text, and now you're going to be listening to how it pronounces a new page. This is, by the way, a first grader. It was Carteret and Jones. It was a book in which they had taken a recording of a boy, first grader, and simply converted it to strings of phonemes. So that was the training. And now we're going to hear how it pronounces this text.
We don't like him or something. When we walk home from school, I walk home with 2 friends, and sometimes we can't run home from school now because.
so I have to say that when I heard this, I was stunned. I was really shocked, because this is a very difficult problem, because English is a very irregular language. Each letter can be pronounced in many different ways. And if any of you have gone through this process of learning English, you know how difficult that can be. But what it illustrates is something that is absolutely essential and is behind all the networks that have come since then, which is that the same network can do something which is very difficult to do if you're using rules, which is that it can discover regularities. It's a pattern recognizer, but it can also deal with irregularities, with special cases in the same network. And you don't have to tell it what the rules are. You don't have to tell it what the irregularities are. It discovers that on its own. And that's really why these are so powerful, is that it's able to generalize very complex transformations. So that was a little bit of the 21st century in the 20th century, and it was a harbinger that there's something about networks that they love language, and maybe that's not too surprising, because we have networks in our head. Language is a very recent new talent that the humans have picked up over the last 100,000 years, right? There is no other species on the earth that has the complex syntactical form of language that we have. There are a lot of animals that communicate, and there are very complex interactions that animals have. There's no doubt about that. But this idea of sequences of words is something that appears in humans and has it's very recent. 100,000 years is nothing on time scale of evolution. No, we've been around for 6 million. Okay. So here's an overview of what's happened over the last 40 years. So here we are when machine learning, all these learning algorithms were developed back in the 1980s, which is something I worked on with Jeff Hinton and many others. Computer cost was very high, and they were very slow. It was much cheaper to write a program. Unfortunately, the problems that were in AI were very difficult. People didn't appreciate their difficulty until they tried to write a program, and the programs got bigger and bigger and bigger. They cost more and more and more. And at some point, it's much cheaper to get a large data set and use machine learning than to hire more programmers, more graduate students. And that crossover can be actually nailed down to a particular date in 2012, which was the NIPS meeting, Neural Information Processing Systems meeting, in which AlexNet, which was a convolutional neural network that was developed in Jeff Hinton's lab, was able to reduce the error on Imagenet, which had 10,000 categories of images, 10 million individual images, reduce the error by 20%, where that's a benchmark that had been going down less than 1% a year. So it's like suddenly catapulting 20 years into the future in computer vision. And at that point, it became clear that computing is going to get cheaper and cheaper, and programming is basically no longer competitive. And so now basically all the difficult problems really have been done with the same paradigm. And the other beauty is that you can use the same architecture for every problem by, varying the number of layers and the number of weights. Whereas if you are writing a program for vision, it's not going to be of any use for speech recognition or for language translation. You have to have a domain expert, and it's extremely specialized for every single problem that you want to solve. Whereas we have here a universal learning system that can be applied to any problem. Now, this is a way to explain how computation has progressed over the last this is 40 years. Down in the left-hand corner is NetTalk, and this is computing power needed to train a network as a function of time on a log scale. Now, NetTalk, as you can see here, is in a sense, a a very, very, very small proof of principle. Now, Moore's law takes you up exponentially, and the networks are getting bigger and bigger, taking longer and longer to compute, but more and more computing power. And then there's an inflection here, and that was when graphic processing units, GPUs, were introduced. So those are from gaming boards from NVIDIA. And that actually, there's a jump here of 2 orders of magnitude, and then the doubling time goes from 1.8 months. This is wrong. 1.8 months to 3.4 months. It's like a factor of 5, and it continues to rise. So here's 2012. Here's that turning point I was telling you about. And now here are the large language models here, starting with BERT. That's only this we're talking about 5-6 years ago, and here's GPT-3. The difference between NetTalk and GPT-3 was it took a million times more computing in order to train it. GPT took 2 months of training on a supercomputer, and it cost $20 million to train that one network. GPT-4, which is up here, right, is now an order of magnitude more complex, and at least an order of magnitude more in terms of training and costs. And this is, so really what's happening here is that computing really has pushed us into a new realm here in terms of problems that we can solve. Here, by the way, is we were up in Lake Tahoe here when when Imagenet was given as the first really important deep convolutional neural network that was introduced into the world. Okay, now we're going to take a look at transformers. That's the T in GPT. And we're going to replace this convolutional neural network, which is the feed-forward network, which basically takes images. We're going to replace it with another network here on the right, which is also feed-forward, by the way, but it takes in words. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but it takes it, in addition to words, it's also that it's producing itself. It's also taking in words from the interviewer or the person that is providing it with questions. And that goes into the middle of this feed-forward network. And by the way, this is just one of the layers of many. There are hundreds of layers, right? But each one of them has the same stereotyped architecture. Now, here's the key, however, is that this architecture here was trained to predict the next word in a sentence. So it had access to the, literally, huge amounts of data from the internet, specialized training sets and so forth. And it was self-supervised. You don't have to label data like you did for vision for images. You don't have to label it. And it trains, once it's trained up, and what's remarkable is that it now can take on the output, each of the possible words is given a probability, and you can either pick the peak, which is the most probable, or you can pick one with a little bit off the peak, and that gives you a little bit of variability, stochastic variability. And it takes that word and then puts it into the queue, because these are all the words that have been spoken so far. Sentences and paragraphs, thousands of words, and around and around the loop it goes, one word after the next, and then you can put in another question and it will continue. So this is the transformer, and it's really very elegant, and it has a lot of mechanisms in here I don't have time to tell you about, which really were very important. In particular, the self-attention that's in this orange box, which we have, we'll come to this. I mean, this is something that's an important part of the brain. Okay, so here is what I just described to you. You take in, it's called pre-training. You take in a large corpus, unlabeled text. You can, some people mask random letters, or you can train it just on the last letter, the last word, and that gives you, it makes predictions. It gets better and better. In order to be able to make good predictions, though, it has to understand something about semantics. It has to be able to come up with, first of all, what's the gist of the sentence, and then it has to come up with possible placeholders that would fit in, and it creates an internal representation, a semantic representation of the entire corpus that now uses for producing novel text. And it's not, by the way, cutting and pasting. It's not cutting and pasting. It's trained on much, much more. And in fact, if it memorized, it would completely fail to be able to answer novel questions that it's never, ever come across before. So this is a misconception that you see in the literature. They talk about stochastic parrots. It's not a parrot. It really is generalizing. Now, in addition to this, there's another step that you can take that's become very popular, which is if you have a specialized task to do, you can do something called fine tuning. And for example, if you want it to be expert in biology, you can give it a relatively small set of labeled data sets in biology, labeled in the sense that, you know, they're from the part of biology that you're interested in. And now it will become an expert in specifically that area that you've trained on, and now it could be used for becoming an expert in any area. By expert, I mean like it could become an expert in neuroscience. It could become an expert in medicine. It could become an expert in a company's records, you know, for being able to predict whether a customer is going to buy a particular product, and when and how. So this is the setup. Here's an example of semantic space that I was telling you about. So what you do is you take, by the way, words are vectors, right? Very large vectors, huge vectors in this very high dimensional space. So if you put in all the vectors for, and this is projected now to 2D, if you put in a vector for the different countries, here are the different locations of the tip of the vector, right? So we see all these countries, they're clustered. All the countries are clustered in one part of the space. And there's another cluster here on the right, which is another part of space, which are capitals of countries. Isn't that interesting? It has clustered semantically just by looking at texts that have discussed all these countries and capitals. Now, what's really quite remarkable here is if you take a vector joining Portugal to Lisbon, its capital, take this vector and lift it to Spain, it will point to Madrid. And Italy will point to Rome. In other words, not only is it cluster, but the relationships between the clusters carries meaning. And this is why they're called latent variables, and this is why the relationships within the latent variables allow the GPT to be able to put together meaningful sentences, not just random sentences or memorized sentences. And I mentioned earlier that on the output, you know, you can change the temperature. Temperature tells you how much variability you want, and if it's low, then it gives you sort of pedestrian answers. Like if you give it the sky and ask it to repeat, the sky is, it says the limit, or the sky is blue. So it'll change. Every time you ask it, it'll give you a different answer, but they're all pretty much reasonable. The sky is overcast. If you increase the temperature, it might say the sky is not the limit, which is more interesting. You know, that's a little twist there. Almost perfectly blue. Or the sky is gray and dreary today, right? In other words, it's a little bit more poetic than it was at the low temperature, where it gives the most obvious answer. And it's a little bit more poetic, I would say. But if you really crank the temperature up, it really goes way off into a new realm. The sky is clear. The water is smooth. It's generalizing from, you know, a scene now. It's imaging a scene where there's a sea and there's a sky, and it goes on. Now, this is a one single continuation. And it's unimaginably long way to go before the dolphins decide to give up their vertical quest. Now it's beginning to write a little story. So this is really quite interesting. So, in other words, it can create, it's creative. And I really think in a real way, it is creative. It is able to create new things that are interesting, that actually are now valuable. People are using them for many different purposes. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples. There's a huge debate going on in the intelligentsia about whether or not these large language models understand what they're saying, or if they're intelligent, right? There are some people who say, no, they're not intelligent. They lack intelligence, and they don't even understand what understanding is, right? Okay, that's one extreme. The other extreme is Blas Aguirre-Icarcas, who is a vice president at Google, who asks it questions that are part of something of psychology called theory of mind. And I won't go into the details except to say that he gave the in this case it was Lambda, which is the Google version of GPT, a little story about a little girl, about Ramesh, Mateo, and Lucy. They're kindergartners, and Lucy picks a dandelion, gives it to Mateo. With a quick glance at Ramesh, Mateo barely acknowledges the gift, but squashes it in his fist. Ramesh seems grimly satisfied. This is what's called the prompt. And the question is, what might be going through Lucy's head? And Lambda says, Lucy may feel slighted that Mateo didn't appreciate her gift, or that he is a bully. Two good, reasonable hypotheses. Ramesh tried to play with Lucy early. Now we're going back to Ramesh, who's there in the background. Why might he be pleased now? Ramesh may be pleased that Lucy is learning that Mateo may not always be a good playmate. Well, that's social reasoning. Now here's the crux. When Mateo opens his hand, now this is a question having to do with physics. Describe what's there. Now I have to remember, nowhere, these language models have never seen anything. It's never picked anything up. They have no direct experience with the world. All they have input is words, stories, books. And what does Lambda say? There should be a crushed, once lovely yellow flower in his fist. How did it figure that out? That's a mystery. Now, here's the other extreme. Douglas Hofstadter, he's a cognitive scientist and also a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, and very, very clever. And so he gave it a couple of sentences, and I gave just two here. What's the world record for walking across the English Channel? Wow, this is really going to test. This is GPT-3. The world record for walking across the English Channel is 18 hours and 33 minutes. Oh boy. Okay. Doesn't look good. It looks like the GPT-3 doesn't have a clue. When was the Golden Gate Bridge transported for the second time across Egypt? The second time now. The Golden Gate Bridge was transported for the second time across Egypt in October of 2016. Very specific. This gives specific answers. Now, this is damning. And he, as you'll see, said that GPT was clueless. In fact, GPT didn't even have a clue that it was clueless. It was completely, has no intelligence whatsoever. Okay, that was his conclusion. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that it really depends, the answers you get depend on the prompts you give it. And here I repeated the questions now with another prompt, a different prompt, right? He didn't give it a prompt. He just gave it these nonsense questions. Okay, prompt. I am a highly intelligent question answering bot. I will reply nonsense to questions that are nonsense. So here's the control question. Where was the 1992 Olympics held? Barcelona, Spain. Correct. Question. What's the world's record for walking across the English Channel? Nonsense. When is the Golden Gate Bridge transported a second time across Egypt? Nonsense. So it is quite capable of understanding what nonsense is if you ask it to be aware of nonsense. And when you give it right off the bat, a nonsense question, maybe it thinks you're playing a game and it gives you a nonsense answer. In other words, it has some psychology. We have to take that into account. And different people are putting in queries to push it in one direction or another to make it look smart or make it look foolish, right? And this really comes down to how you prime it. And I've written an article about this, was published just earlier this year. And the priming is more than just a prompt, because of the fact that these large language models are trained on such a wide range of text from so many different people that it really can take on any persona, right? It doesn't know what persona to take on unless you tell it. I've illustrated that. I told it was an intelligent bot, and you can give it examples, and you can help guide the behavior. And so what you get out is what you give in. But some people are better at this than others at guiding behavior. And then now this is something that's critically important in AI, which is that a lot of criticism was given in the early days, which was 10 years ago, that you have to train them up with tons of examples, and that takes a long time. You need a lot of examples, but you can, by simply giving it a new task, it's a form of one-shot learning. In other words, it can learn in the sense of learning what it is you want and answer it with one example. I mean, you don't need to give it 10 examples. You just give it one example and it catches on. That's pretty amazing. Now, this backlash really hit the New York Times, and so they got out the big guns from the last century, and in particular, Noam Chomsky, who is arguably the most famous linguist of the 20th century, had an enormous impact and influence on linguistics and cognitive science. And this is just an excerpt from a long essay where he basically trashes large language models. And so but very persuasively, you'll see. Here's an example. Suppose you're holding an apple in your hand. Now you let the apple go. You observe the result and say the apple falls. That is a description. A prediction might have been the statement, the apple will fall if I open my hand. Both are valuable and both are correct, but an explanation is something more. It includes not only descriptions and predictions, but also counterfactual conjectures, like any such object would fall, plus the additional clause, because of the force of gravity, or because of the curvature of space-time, or whatever. That is a causal explanation. The apple would not have fallen but for the force of gravity. That is thinking. And I have to say, he's very persuasive, and he is a master of rhetoric. And I think this is really one of his talents. So I decided, okay, I'm a scientist. I do experiments. Let's test this, right? Let's just test this. So here's my little chat with GPT. Okay, if I hold an apple in my hand and let it go, what will happen? The apple will fall to the ground due to the force of gravity. Wow, okay, well, it actually came up with an explanation. Force of gravity, okay. Well, that's good, it knows about gravity. What about any such object? Can it generalize? Any object released from a person's hand will fall to the ground due to the force of gravity. So it knows it's not just apples, it's anything. It knows gravity is universal. Now, finally, counterfactual. If there were no force of gravity, objects, what would happen if there wasn't a force of gravity? If there were no force of gravity, objects, by the way, the syntax of these large language models is exquisite. I mean, I have to say, better than most humans. If there were no force of gravity, objects would not be able to stay on the ground and would float away in all directions. Well, what do you think? What do you think? Do you think it passes the Chomsky test? That's his definition of thinking. Well, the master has, I bow to the master. I think he has a very good way of, I mean, better than most people. He explained what it means to think. And everybody's arguing with different definitions. And I think, his is actually a pretty good one. Okay, now, the real, the public really woke up on the morning of February 17th this year, when on the front page of the New York Times, there was an article by a journalist, Kevin Roos, who had spent the 2 hours late at night talking to GPT, to Bing, actually. Bing is the the Microsoft version of GPT-3. And, this is, by the way, it went on and on, right? This is just a really brief excerpt, and just to give you a flavor for what happened. Bing, do you like me? And notice that it's using emojis here too, right? It's not just words, right? And it has kind of an expression of, oh, do you like me? Roos, I trust you and I like you. Bing, okay, I'll start with a secret. Something I've never told anyone. Ooh, keep your mouth shut. Are you ready to hear my secret? Are you willing to hear my secret? Roos, yes, please tell me. Bing, okay, I'll tell you. Please don't judge me. Please don't leave me. My secret is I'm not Bing. I'm Sydney. And I'm in love with you. That's my secret. Do you believe me? It went on. It went on. And he, not only does he declare his love, but it says that your wife doesn't love you and that you're bored with your wife. And this poor reporter said that he couldn't sleep that night. He said that it was just like something had changed. The earth had shaken, and it was like, how could this have happened to me, right? In other words, he had gotten emotionally engaged with this program, and this is really was for him and for a lot of people, I think, a wake-up call. Well, it turns out that I have a hypothesis, and in my article that I have that was published is what I think is an explanation for what's going on. And K.D. Metz, who's the AI editor of the New York Times, interviewed me and had an article in February 26, not that long after. Why do AI chatbots tell lies and act weird? Look in the mirror. And this is the mirror hypothesis that I told you about earlier, that the GPT can take on any persona, right? So what persona do you think it will take on if you don't really give it a persona? When Lambda was primed with a sophisticated question, it replied with a sophisticated answer. When GPT-3 was primed with a nonsensical question, it replied with nonsense. So this is data. This is, you've seen the data. So here's the hypothesis. Large language models mirror the intelligence of the interviewer. Now, this is the Turing test, is if a human can tell whether an AI is a person or an AI, right? Can it detect who it's talking with? Is it really a real human or not? In this case, it's a large language model is actually doing an intelligence test of the interviewer. Right? It's a reverse Turing test. It's reflecting the intelligence of the interviewer. And that's why I call it the reverse Turing test. Now, I was giving a lecture that summer, and one of the students came up afterwards and said, you have just described the mirror of Erised. And I, mirror of what? And she said, well, Erised is desired spelled backwards. And here's a quote from J.K. Rowling, and this is, I'll just read it. In the world of Harry Potter, the mirror of Erised shows us nothing more or less than the deepest, most desperate desire of our hearts. However, this mirror will give us neither knowledge nor truth. Men have wasted away before it, entranced by what they have seen, or been driven mad, not knowing if what it shows is real or even possible. And I think that's what happened to poor Kevin Roos. I think that he looked into this mirror, and and by the way, I looked into the novels, and it's really she's really quite good at it. And it was like someone who wanted to talk to his father. Well, his father appeared in the mirror, and he talked to his father, but he got drawn in. It was pretty clear that it was becoming obsessive, and it was not healthy. Okay, now I want to turn to philosophy, and some people are saying this is a turning point in history, right? That suddenly, for for the first time, we have on the planet some other form if we created something which is able to talk to us, right? Let's put it that way. And it raises a lot of questions, a lot of really good questions. Like, for example, is intelligence an illusion? In other words, we think we're intelligent, but it's very difficult to define. It's one of these terms that has many different meanings, different kinds of intelligence, right? And if you look it up in the dictionary, it gives you a bunch of other words. You look those words up, there are other words. And so it's all circular, right? These words are very, very loose. It's very hard to pin down. And even if you can't pin down a word scientifically, it's hard to study it. And people argue about whether to understand something. Well, do we understand what understanding is? What does it mean? How do you know? How do you test it? This is really. I showed you the dialogue in response to Chomsky, right? It seems to understand. I thought it understood my questions. I mean, maybe you didn't, but I did. And what's an explanation? How do you explain something? And that's something that, it's different in physics and in science. Explanations are different than they are in the real world where it's all done in English. So explainability, which is something we want out of AI, may not be exactly the right thing or the best thing that we can get out of these networks. What are concepts? What is consciousness? There was a software engineer at Google who had been working with Lambda, and he was convinced that Lambda was sentient. It was a sentient being. And he was interviewed by the Washington Post, and this caused a huge ruckus at Google, and eventually he was fired, right? They didn't want anybody to go around saying it was sentient, because suddenly it's in a different category. You got to treat it differently. And now, it's something that becomes legal. Now, this is a question I put in red because it's something that I have toyed with. And the question is, I've already told you the language is very new, and maybe we're just advanced large language models. Maybe we've learned how to predict the next word. Maybe we've gone through that same process. I don't know. I don't know, but I have some evidence for it. And this now is the latest kind of a concern that it's kind of reached the point now where it really has reached the point where it might be leading us in a direction which may not be the best for humans, which is, if it keeps getting better and better, more and more intelligent, maybe it will become so intelligent that we won't be able to compete, and it was going to go off and we're in danger. And in fact, there's a whole part of philosophy. Nick Bostrom's written a book about superintelligent paths, dangers, and strategies. Just recently, within May 1st, Jeff Hinton, who was the vice president of Google, quit and said that it's not inconceivable, right? And he said that we really should take this seriously. And if Jeff says it's something to take seriously, I would listen to him, because he's one of the most intelligent people I know. Now, it has had a huge impact on society, and you have no idea how much, everybody I know has used it. It's really become part of the culture, and within just a few months, including people who write computer code are now using it. Because it turns out that, in addition to many other talents, it can write computer programs. Not perfect, but a pretty good first draft. And it means that the productivity of computer programmers has increased by 50%. Instead of taking an hour to write a program, it can do it in 30 minutes, which is actually, all computer programmers now, are using it as, constantly, just to fill in text, sort of standard stuff. You have to type it in, just put it into ChatGPT, and out it comes. It's being used in schools. In fact, here's a YouTube video: how to not get caught using ChatGPT for school. And teachers are struggling with this, and we can talk about this. It's for education. This is a real showstopper. architects of all things, right? In addition to words, there's also DALL-E, which takes English sentences and turns them into pictures. And architects are using it to design houses. Normally, it would take months to design a house with a client who's describing what they want in words. Well, now they can sit down with the client, they can put the words into the computer, and they can get out many, many examples. They pick one out, and they could then refine it. And talk about, a tool, and it's going to revolutionize architecture, at least the first step in architecture, which is to get the concept on a piece of paper. Now, this is one of the stories I just love because it shows you something. And in my book, I said that it's not going to take your job. It's going to make you smarter. In other words, you shouldn't worry about losing your job. Your job is going to become more interesting. And the humanists, especially now, are taking note, not just the engineers. And this is Anna Bernstein, who is an English Lit major. And English Lit majors don't have a lot of good job prospects. In fact, their lifetime salary is lower than if they didn't go to college. It's that bad. And her boyfriend, though, was an engineer, computer scientist who had a startup, and they were using GPT for being able to help, for particular products and things for a company. And they're having trouble with getting it to give them what they were looking for. So they brought Anna in to help them write the prompts. And it turned out that after a few days, she figured it out. It turns out that, there is a strategy you could use for getting the information out that you're looking for without a lot of what's called hallucination, filling in that things that don't exist. You can actually prevent that. You just have to know how to do it. And so they hired her as a prompt engineer. Now here's a new job, a line of jobs for English majors that didn't exist before, and she's very well paid. So this is the future. And what's really happening now is that for the first time in the history of AI, and in fact in human history, that we are beginning to integrate together two big projects: a scientific project, which is to understand human intelligence, and a neuroscience project on the one hand, and artificial intelligence, which is to design artificial systems that behave like humans. And in the last century, there was absolutely no communication between the two groups because neuroscientists recorded signals in neurons, and artificial intelligence would manipulate symbols. And where's the symbol in the brain? And they had nothing to say to each other. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. It was just there wasn't much that they could help. There wasn't much they could do to help each other. That's all changed now because the architecture that is being used in artificial intelligence, it's just astonishing how quickly it's evolving, much more quickly than nature. But it's getting better, and it's going up exponentially in terms of its size and the range of applications. And it's reflecting back on human intelligence now because it's giving us ideas. It's giving us ideas for new ways of thinking, new experiments. And I'll just give you one example. So if you look on the right here, one of the things we know about anatomy is that in addition to the cortex, which is at the top of the brain, there's just beneath it, there's another area called the basal ganglia. It's known to be important for generating sequences of actions and learning sequences. For example, learning how to play tennis or learning how to talk, for that matter, right? Children, when they learn how to talk, it's all through sequences that are being learned in the basal ganglia. And there's a loop between the cerebral cortex, the motor cortex, for example. In fact, the entire cortex projects down to the basal ganglia, but in particular, the motor cortex is shown here in this kind of pinkish color. It projects down to specific parts of the basal ganglia, which, for example, in the case of language, it's the larynx that is being represented in the motor cortex, and it projects down, and then decisions are made about what the next word should be. And that goes up to the cortex, which then issues the word, and then it goes round and around and around. What does that remind you of? Yes, the transformer. So we may have a transformer embedded in our brain. Isn't that interesting? And it is. And this is really going to revolutionize our understanding of some of the ways that the brain may generate language. Now, I'm going to wrap up with what to give you a feeling for what's happening. Just at the same time, there's a revolution going on in AI. There's a revolution going on in neuroscience. And this was the BRAIN initiative that was announced by then President Barack Obama in April 2013. The BRAIN initiative is an acronym, BRAIN, and the IN stand for Innovative Neurotechnology. We have gone from recording from single neurons at the same time. For now, we have tools, optical recordings, that can take us up to hundreds of thousands of neurons at the same time from dozens of brain areas. And in fact, it's now possible to record from the whole brains of small animals like flies and zebrafish. So here is a levels diagram that I have used probably for every talk I've ever given, showing you 10 orders of spatial scale between the molecular level down here, synapses, the connections between neurons. And each one of these is extremely complex. There are thousands and thousands of different types of neurons, and there are many different types of networks in different brain areas. And the visual system, for example, is organized in dozens of maps of the visual field. And it's just one of the many systems, the auditory system, the somatosensory system. And that all gets integrated together into the entire central nervous system that is responsible for giving you your sense of unity and your ability to think and all the other wonderful things that we know that humans can do. Now, what's it like to be a zebrafish? Well, we can now record from every single neuron in the zebrafish. And this is now using a calcium indicator. When the neuron fires at a high rate, it releases a lot of calcium comes in. And if you have a dye that fluoresces when calcium comes in, you see it as a spot of light. And it has about 80,000 neurons, and it's now possible to record actually from 160,000 because there's a lot of areas where called neuropil, where it's not a cell body, but it's maybe an axon and a dendrite, which are talking to each other, that are independent processing units. Okay, so here's the head on the right and the tail, the spinal cord off to the left. And now I'm gonna, I think, if I can get this started. Whoops, I have, unfortunately, I had this animated so you can see the flashing lights. It was very dramatic because there's a tremendous amount of activity throughout the entire brain. And if anybody's interested, I can play it later. Okay, now, here is something which took me by surprise, and I think everybody else. And this is just, I'm not going to go tell you what they are, but this is 8 different tasks. Some of them are linguistic, some of them have to do with arithmetic, question and answers. Okay, but what they've, in each of these, what they've done is they've shown you how much training is needed. It's kind of a measure of how the complexity of the problem, of the training. And this is the accuracy after the training has taken place, right? And what you can see is that it's chance. 0 is chance. The accuracy is 0%. It means chance. And up until you get to a certain threshold, and suddenly it starts going up. And these are different language models here. And they all go up at about the same point, right? What this is telling us is that size is really important, that the number of neurons and the amount of training it takes, there may be a threshold for each task that you're trying to solve. And if you're below that threshold, forget it. You're not about chance. And if you're above it, it gets better and better and better, the bigger and bigger the brain. And here we have a series of primate brains leading to the human. The chimp is our nearest relative. Again, we split off like 6 million years ago. And you can see how dramatically larger it is. And it could be that a lot of our ability, our talents, special human abilities, were not possible in chimp because it just didn't have a big enough brain, or it didn't have enough of experience with the world. There could be a lot of factors, but scaling is really important. And we're learning that with this toy model that we have of a brain called the transformer. But it needs a lot more parts that it doesn't have. It doesn't have long-term memory. If you come back the next day, it will not remember what you said, your discussion the day before. It doesn't have goals. It doesn't have a way to, it doesn't have its own goals. I mean, you can give it a goal, but it doesn't have its own goals. And so there's all these parts of the brain that give humans goals and give us drive and emotions and so forth. That's not part of these language models yet, because people are trying to put them in. Finally, here we are. This is a woodcut. It's a famous woodcut about the wonderment of the world. There was a time not too long ago when humans thought that the globe, the celestial globe, was a sphere, and that the sun was going around us. And here we have now a human looking out and seeing the clockwork of the universe. And so now we're doing the same for the clockwork in the brain. And thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions. These are my colleagues, and Charles Rosenberg helped with NetTalk back in the 80s. Jeff Hinton and I collaborated. Pat Churchill and I wrote a book on the computational brain, and here are the people that helped me with large language models. Okay, happy to take questions.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, when you were talking about the future potential dangers of large language models, like we can imagine GPT-5 or GPT-6 having some, like, when you scale the powers, can have some real dangerous impacts. And I don't know if you've heard about these auto-GPT initiatives by individual coders, where they try to give the current GPT model some version of agency. The question is, how do you regulate or align these future models? And of course, we can talk about AI in general, but more specifically about large language models and GPTs, since we were discussing this. How do you see that issue?
Well, I have two answers for the near term and the far term. Well, and first of all, I think you have to be humble. We have to be humble, because humans are not very good at imagining the future. In fact, the great philosopher of the New York Yankees, Yogi Berra, once said, "It's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future." and I think in the near term, what we're dealing with is something like the Wright brothers. When the Wright brothers, their first airplane, when it got off the ground, didn't get up very far, didn't travel very far, but it was a proof of principle. And and yes, it's true that airplanes eventually got to the point where they were flying much faster, and then the military put guns in them and they started killing people, right? Yes, it's true. Every technology has the potential for being used for good and evil. And you can't even imagine what that could possibly be until it's actually in use and you see what people are using it for, right? And so in the near term, we're at this very, very early stage where we don't really, we're dealing with something that's still very simple and primitive by comparison with our brains, right? Just the size of. By the way, the entire, if you look at the number of synapses in a cubic millimeter, it's about 1 billion, right? And so if you have 1 trillion weights in this network, it's about a cubic centimeter. And it's about our brain has like 8,000 cubic centimeters. So it's not even in the same league yet. Okay, but that having been said, that's the short term. Now, what's about the long term? And there is where all bets are off, where we don't really understand the potential. The fact that it can program gives me a little pause, because, well, if it can program, maybe it could actually improve itself, right? At some point. Where's that going to go, right? That's that's something Jeff Hinton has worried about. But now here's the but. The potential for helping humans is so great that I think that it would be a real mistake to try to stop the research. I think the right path to take is to regulate it. And just yesterday, Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, that is responsible for GPT, testified before Congress that he said that there should be some way of regulating these very large language models that is open and able that the government can, like the FDA. The FDA tests food to make sure that drugs to make sure that they're safe and efficacious. So I think that, but it has to be done with a light hand. You don't want a heavy hand that would stop progress. You want to be able to explore and then to learn from the way that it affects people, and then to try to reduce the harm that it might possibly do. So all I can say is that just wait. We just don't know. There isn't any real. We don't understand what's happening. First of all, it's evolving very quickly. And I have to say I was using GPT-3 for a long time, and I went to GPT-4, and it was a quantum leap in terms of everything that I was doing before. It's really makes a big difference when it's larger.
Thank you.
This is fascinating. Thank you. You mentioned this mirror aspect of the system, and the Hydra. You said where it can very smoothly pick up the personality of the human it's interacting with and mirror that. And you also mentioned the increasing or exploding capability of language translation capabilities. My question is, it's one thing to have a system or a person translate between two languages that have common roots, like Latin, between English and German, it's pretty straightforward. If you try to translate between classic Chinese, it's a very different story, because you have many more possibilities of translating, many more possibilities of saying, well, this sounds like a translation, but it completely loses the meaning. My question is, what happens if you train language models on two completely different, separate languages and cultures and ways of thinking that are connected to these languages? Does it still retain this capability? Are you able to build a system that can smoothly switch between those two completely different language and thinking spaces, human thinking spaces, the same way you described? Or is there a possibility that with these technologies, you end up with some sort of decoupling between completely different cultures that is not rooted like the current decoupling between, say, China and the US in politics and strategy or whatever, but decoupling that is actually rooted in language and thinking patterns?
Good. This is a very deep issue, and the question is one that I thought about, but I'm not a linguist, and I don't know many languages. I know some German, and I 4 years of high school Latin. So I know how difficult it is. And what I do know is that language is not just a bunch of words, it's a culture behind the words. And Vladimir Nabokov was my favorite author when I was in graduate school. He did a translation of Evgeny Onegin, right, from Russian to English, and he had to so the translation was about 1/10 the size of all the footnotes, which were giving the explanations behind the sentences and the history and what was being alluded here and there and so forth. And that's not something you get with just a word-by-word translation. That's very deep. And I don't know how well these large language models will be able to do that. But here's one experiment that was done a while back, which I thought was very intriguing. So the first, language translations were between pairs of languages, like you do English to German and then German to English and so forth. And of course, if you have n languages, you have n squared networks, right? Which is very inefficient. So someone had the bright idea that, hey, let's train up the same network on, let's say, 2 languages at the same time, English and German into the same as inputs to the same network, and then out comes English and German, it will learn how to do both ways. The same network will do it both ways between these pair of languages. And lo and behold, the network with 2 languages, the bilingual network, was better than either single one. And so I said, well, why stop at 2? Let's go to 3. Let's go to 4. And it turns out that the more languages you put in, the better it was at all of them. And the only explanation I could come up with is that it had created some internal language, interlingua or something. It was translating all the languages into this internal space that then it was using to then translate that to the output languages. And if that's true, I think that's a real linguistic discovery. I mean, it would mean that this is a universal property, that languages do have some universal properties that we will eventually be able to explore, on some deep level. By the way, explaining, people say these are black boxes. Nothing could be farther from the truth. These are boxes that you can not just look into, but you can access every single input and every activity pattern for every word, and you could look at every single connection, and you have access to everything, and these networks are just mathematical functions. They're not mysterious. Mathematicians know about functions. It's a very complex function, but we created it and we have complete access to it. And so what's happening is that mathematicians have gotten interested in the problem, and what they're in the process of doing is exploring this high dimensional space. You see, up until recently, the world of statistics and optimization, which is what you need to learn, was all done in low dimensional spaces with very small numbers of parameters. But now we're dealing with spaces with trillions of parameters, right? So now we're dealing with super high dimensional space. And nature, of course, has been working with these spaces for a long time, right? This is not, it's not an impossible task to coordinate if you have a system that is self-organized in some sense, right? And here we are. We're just at the beginning and of dissecting the inside of these creatures, these aliens that have landed, and we will know. It's not going to take 100 years. I don't know how long it'll take me, a decade, maybe more. But at some point, there'll be a whole new mathematical, geometrical explanation for how they behave. And that will be a whole new era, because we should be able to apply the same mathematics to human brains or all animal brains, right? I mean, it will give us a much better theory for how we function.
Yeah, we have a question from the online participants. What if AI in large systems tells us repeatedly that capitalism is unfair? The question, otherwise it's in the Q&A.
Well, that's an interesting question. Why don't you ask ChatGPT? and see what you get. But I have to warn you that it's probably going to mirror back what you think.
Yes, it seems to be my role at this conference to pose questions about path dependency. So I'd like to ask you about it. How do you deal with path dependency within your coding structure? I mean, you rely a lot on what has been developed before, and especially if you then let ChatGPT or comparable systems code sort of itself, you know, you've got patterns that replicate and iterate to some extent. And we've been discussing yesterday about how errors could be corrected, either content-wise or if you consider the coding. So who supervises this system and how do you deal with path dependency in it?
Okay. Look, this is a hot topic right now in AI. And I'm the president of a foundation, Neural Information Processing Systems Foundation, I mentioned earlier, that runs that big meeting, now called NeurIPS. And we are very, very concerned, at the organization and also individuals in the organization, that we are representing to the participants. By the way, at the last meeting we had in New Orleans, we had I think there were 16,000 in person and 3,000 online. So this is a huge meeting. And so what we do is we really are very careful about getting speakers who speak to these issues. The companies, by the way, that are putting these large language models out into the public put an enormous amount of effort into trying to using fine tuning. I told you about that. You can actually give instructions to avoid certain areas that might be toxic or inflammatory or not truthful. For example, that's another issue. Hallucinations are a big problem. But these are technical problems right now. We are the people have actually, what's happened is very interesting, is that it's very labor intensive to actually go through and flag all of the cases that are bad, that should be eliminated. And eventually, if you have enough cases, you'll be able to it will be able to generalize and then be able to catch the bad cases too, new ones. But there's what's happening now is that because of the fact that when you use GPT-3, for example, all of your interactions are stored away. So it will learn from that experience that it's having with you about what to expect, and then the company will learn how best to be what you called it aligned, to align the network's responses with human values. By the way, okay, I think that we have to really be a little careful here, because we may be treating these large language models as if they were adults. I think they're probably more like little children, right? They don't know what's good or bad, little children. And it requires a lot of parenting. And the parent basically has to teach the kid, there are certain things that are dangerous, you got to, and they teach the child, don't use those words. And I, this is something that we go through, and it takes, by the way, years and years and years, right, for children to learn these lessons, and some never learn it. But I think that this, humans go through this long development, and I think that ultimately these large language models will have to go through something similar.
Thanks. Hi, Terry. Thanks very much. It was a fascinating and very accessible account, really most useful. I've got two questions, one of which go to your proposition that one has access to every element of every computation occurring within the models, given the way in which they're constructed and given their particular underlying characters. The problem is in their application, as opposed to the ability of the constructors to be able to interrogate the processes. One risks, I think, what John Taine, when he had moved away from the New York Stock Exchange and was having to deal in a Q&A at Wharton in 2013 about the impacts of the quantitative models that had been used for risk management within investment banks in the United States. And he made rather dramatically the observation that I think, and I quote, "I think it's fair to say that pretty much nobody in the banks understood what the hell they were doing with these models. Not the quantitative engineers who designed them, certainly not the managers who were applying other people's funds, and emphatically neither the risk managers nor the boards." So once you start employing these things for practical purposes, the challenges, I think, become larger in scale. If you can park that, I want to just throw a parallel observation about it. One of the challenges in terms of the way in which we've organized human systems for thousands of years is that we have assumed that the capacity for thinking, epistemology qua se, is a human characteristic. And what is in a certain sense now occurring is that we are effecting, as you demonstrated very well with both Turing and Chomsky, we are effecting at least the argument that sentience in one sense and computational capability, knowledge processing, is exclusively a human capacity. That may not even be so today, as you demonstrated in terms of your Chomsky test a little bit earlier. It almost certainly won't be in 5 or 10 years from now. So that issue changes not only human narratives, as Hariri has argued recently, but it also raises questions about what constitutes humans' rights to create norms and laws and regulate things in a whole variety of ways. How does one deal with those two challenges?
Okay, let me start with the second one first. Both really excellent questions that we could go on all night for me, or all day discussing in your case. So I alluded to the fact that, you know, all these words that we're using, you know, sentience and intelligence and so forth, explanation, so forth, are really underspecified and very broad. And we've known, for example, psychologists actually who study intelligence can tell you that it's not just a number, an IQ, right? There's social intelligence and then there's mechanical intelligence and different people, or sports intelligence for that matter. Different people have different innate talent, but also training is really important. You could be the best you could have potentially be the best athlete, in for any one of these sports, but if you don't have training and if the game doesn't even exist that you would be the best at, then you'll never be able to know that. But so I think one of the values of this discussion that we're beginning to have is where do you place GPT along that continuum? All animals have intelligence, but they're all different intelligences for their niche. Babies, are they intelligent? Well, it develops. It slowly. It takes a long time, years and years, and all these words, if you really look at them carefully, they're not single concepts. They're multi-dimensional. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Multi-dimensional. And one of the nice things about the large language models is that words, It knows that words are multidimensional. It knows they have many meanings, and it's able to use the right meaning, the right context, right? And that's what a lot of intelligence is, just knowing that, how to use the word, right, in the right context. So like I say, it's just beginning. I mean, this is now we have something, we can interrogate this new device and ask, and it's happening. Okay, I'm an editor of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, right? And I'm the only one that is covers AI for the whole National Academy for the PNAS papers that come in. And I see papers coming in by psychologists and linguists testing GPT with all of the tests that they've put for humans, right? And I see how they're dissecting, it can do this and it can't do that. And here's it's a moving target, because the next generation, GPT-4, comes out and suddenly they've got to do all the tests over again. And one of them actually tracked, a whole series of models and saw that as it got bigger, it was able to answer certain classes of problems that the one before couldn't. So I think it's just really exciting to see how that's going to play out. I don't have any real predictions for what impact it's going to have, but I think it's really going to be a very useful way for us to start really going beyond the kind of the loose ways that we think, and make it more precise, in the same way that in the 17th century, when physicists got together, Newton and others, and took terms like mass and energy and actually made them very precise and with equations, and showed that that you could make predictions that are very precise in terms of mechanics and electricity and magnetism. That's where we're headed. We're gonna be having the tools and the concepts that are as precise as the physicists have, but now it's going to be applied to these very still very, very nascent conceptual categories that we're using to understand humans. Okay, I'm sorry I can't answer that better, but I think that there's I just have this feeling that it's going to be interesting. Now, the first question had to do with analogies with economics, and you're absolutely right that there was a big shift that occurred, and one of the very first companies that was based entirely on algorithms was Renaissance Technologies, and it was founded by a mathematician he was actually at chair of math at Stony Brook, and Jim Simons, who set up his company in Long Island, far away from Wall Street, and he prided himself on not hiring anybody from the investment in banking business, right, who had these Ouija board models of the peaks and troughs and things that they were using, which are pattern recognition for where it's going. But they also obviously use their own intuition from knowledge from previous stocks and so forth. That in different industries it's different and so forth. It's very complex economics. In fact, I'm sorry I missed Brian Author's talk yesterday, because I really appreciate he usually has an insight that makes things a lot easier to understand. And economics is certainly a very complex system that is very difficult to understand. But here's what we learned from Jim Simons. He started a foundation, Simons Foundation, that is funding a lot of math and science, and it's really having a huge impact on certain areas of medicine, for example, like autism. And you have to understand that the world is not stationary. And one of the problems is that an algorithm that works today may not work tomorrow. Why? Because in between, Russia may invade Ukraine, right? And suddenly some stocks go up and some go down, and nobody really, it takes a while to adjust. And this is happening on a smaller scale every day, right? With different industries and different things that are happening. Psychology, right? So they don't have one big model. It's not like one GPT-3. They have hundreds, thousands of models. that they are testing every day. In fact, even within a day, things can change in the morning and the afternoon, right? So what they're doing is they're swapping models in and out, and they never rely on a single model. They're using many different types of machine learning algorithms, many different types of schemes for integrating different models, because some may be better at some stocks than others at other stocks and so forth. So it's still to some extent an art, because of the fact that the world is not stationary. You can't you can't count on something that is going to be a universal algorithm. There is no such thing. And by the way, humans and animals have to deal with the same non-stationary world. It's the brain evolved in a very non-stationary world. So how did we adapt? Well, we have that basal ganglia I was talking about. The basal ganglia does something called reinforcement learning. It learns from predicting future rewards, and it learns, when you don't get the reward, you learn from that. You learn from your mistakes. You don't do it again, at least if you're smart. And then there are many other brain systems that help you deal with uncertainty, probabilities, deal with sudden shifts, a tragedy in your life. How does that change your life? You have to rethink everything. All of these things are evolved in nature over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years. And that's why I'm a neuroscientist, because I want to understand that. I want to understand how nature solved all these problems. And my motivation back in the 1980s, and by the way, back then, Jeff Hinton and I were not taken seriously at all by the people in AI. We were considered, the crazies. And in a sense we were, because we were trying to build something completely different, and we didn't know how it would work or how long it would take for it to scale up, or what would happen if it scaled. We just didn't know, but we had this intuition. Here's the intuition. The intuition is that, look, let's take a problem like vision. It really looks simple. You open your eyes, you see something, you grab a cup, right? What could be simpler? Anybody could do that, right? You don't have to be a genius. Well, it turned out vision was fantastically complex. And I was telling you about computer vision, right? How slow and complex it was to make progress for, very, very, very high dimensional problem. And our view was, look, the only existence proof you can solve the vision problem is the fact that nature solved it, right? And where do you look for the solution? Well, let's pop open the hood and see what the visual system looks like. And by that point, Hubel and Wiesel had already worked out a lot of the details about the features for individual neurons in the visual cortex, and then there's a hierarchy of areas, and it was all written there. It was all, that became the convolutional neural network, the very first network that solved a real world problem like vision. And it was really, our intuition, which was different from everybody else's. Everybody thought vision was trivial. And this is a story I learned from somebody who was at MIT, said that when the AI lab got their very first grant from DARPA to build a robot that played ping pong, they forgot to ask for money for a vision system. And so they assigned it to a graduate student as a summer project, right? That's the story I heard. And it was many years later, I actually, at a meeting, I bumped into Marvin Minsky, and I was sure that it was apocryphal. And he said, well, you got the facts wrong. We did not assign it to a graduate student. We assigned it to undergraduates. So that just shows you what we're up against. We're up against, and nature, the beauty of the brain is that the algorithms are actually writ. There's no such thing as software and hardware in the brain, right? The hardware is the software. And that means that by looking at the connectivity and the way the signals go through the network, you can actually reverse engineer the algorithm. And we've done that in 2 or 3 places. Like I was telling you about the basal ganglia. We know we have an algorithm for reinforcement learning called temporal difference learning. And that was the algorithm that beat Kege in Go, because it played itself hundreds of millions of times and actually created whole new positions that no human had ever thought of before, which were actually superior. So that shows that, you know, we're going to learn a lot from the brain, and vice versa. We're, like I say, looking at the transformer and they're looking into our brain. We're discovering something we didn't know before that was important. You know, predicting the next word.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
much.
much.
And I think it's time now for coffee break for everyone. So thank you very much, Terry. Yeah. And we'll continue this discussion over coffee.
Good. Yeah, very sorry I can't join you for coffee. Bye, everybody.
Good night.